Remember that toy from back in the mid-2000s that would guess what you're thinking of by asking 20 questions? They'd usually be about things that in one way or another are related to whatever you're thinking of. Well, this is kind of similar. What do three Central African kingdoms, colonialism, specifically Portuguese colonialism, a Cuban-backed communist insurgency, oil, and the 2010 Africa Cup of Nations all have in common? Cabinda. This tiny exclave, separated from the rest of Angola by a narrow strip of territory belonging to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, briefly declared its independence in 1975, and still maintains an as of yet unrecognized government in exile with offices in Paris, France, and Pointe-Noire, the second largest city in the Republic of Congo, Brazzaville. Though often described as a low-intensity conflict, there still very much is an ongoing insurgency in Cabinda, which may have displaced as many as 25,000 people since the mid-1970s. Moreover, in June 2020, 2 separatists were reportedly killed in clashes with the Angolan military. But why? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to the beginning, which in our case is the 15th century. Okay, so during this time, much of Central Africa was controlled by the vast Kingdom of Kongo. However, beyond the kingdom's immediate borders, the Mwene Kongo, literally Lord of the Congo, exercised indirect control via a number of vassal states. In what nowadays is Cabinda, these included the kingdoms of Ngoyo, Loango, and Kakongo. Congolese power eventually started to wane though, and in the case of Ngoyo, that kingdom was effectively independent around 1550. A big factor explaining this, fragmentation was growth of the slave trade. Now, slavery in Central Africa predated the arrival of Europeans, with historical records from King Afonso I of Congo showing the capture of slaves went hand in hand with the kingdom's campaigns of expansion. Things changed, however, following the introduction of sugarcane on São Tomé and Príncipe in the early 1500s. Despite the island's rich volcanic soil, its cultivation was quite labor-intensive, and while Portugal, which had discovered the uninhabited islands in 1470, initially made use of criminals and orphans, notably Jewish children from Europe, it soon began to import a large number of slaves from the African mainland, including those from the Kingdom of Kongo. Estimates vary, but it seems likely the kingdom was supplying the Portuguese with around 4,000 to 5,000 slaves a year. In time, Portugal decided to cut out the middleman and began dealing with some of the previously mentioned vassal kingdoms directly. This, in turn, brought wealth and power to the local nobility, with the Ngoyo port of Cabinda and the Kakongo port of Malemba becoming major centers for the export of slaves. At the same time, this move diminished the power of the Kingdom of Kongo, which now exercised little practical control over its former vassals. By the 18th century, the Portuguese, alongside the British and Dutch, had established trading posts, logging camps, and small palm oil processing factories in the lands north of the Congo River. Local rulers, nevertheless, were still wary of a more permanent foreign presence, which in part explains Ngoyo and Kakongo's decision to ally themselves with the French and destroy a Portuguese fort in 1783-84. Despite winning this battle in a sort of colonial proxy war, Portugal would occupy the coast in 1883, effectively blocking any further action by its European rival. A short time later, in 1885, Ngoyo, having failed to elect a new king and disintegrated into a collection of petty principalities, signed the Treaty of Simulambuco, thereby making it a protectorate of the Portuguese crown. And thus, Cabinda became a part of the Portuguese Colonial Empire. Okay, let's pause for a moment here. I said became a part of the Portuguese Colonial Empire because Cabinda, sometimes referred to as Portuguese Congo, was exactly that, a part of Portugal's vast colonial empire that was considered separate from the much larger colony of Portuguese West Africa to its south. Portuguese Congo, aka Cabinda, being separate from Portuguese West Africa, while implied by the very nature of the Treaty of Simulambuco, was seemingly reconfirmed in the Berlin Conference, in which the two colonies were treated as distinct entities. It was also during this conference that Portugal agreed to cede a narrow corridor of land to Belgium, thereby allowing the Belgian Congo access to the Atlantic and separating its once contiguous Central African colonies. With an area of about 2,810 square miles, making it a little bigger than modern Palestine, Lisbon maintained a distinction between Portuguese Congo and Portuguese West Africa, mostly until 1956, when the former was attached to the newly rebranded overseas province of Angola. Then, in 1968, Cabinda's offshore oil reserves were discovered, and by 1973, oil had surpassed all other exports from Portuguese Angola. And I think we need to discuss this for a moment. While Cabinda today produces hardwoods, coffee, cocoa, crude rubber, and palm oil, what it's best known for is oil. The exclave possesses considerable offshore oil reserves that have earned it the nickname the Kuwait of Africa. And Cabinda accounts for nearly 60% of Angola's oil production. That's around 900,000 barrels of oil a day, which in 2002 accounted for approximately 86.5% of government revenue. Or put another way, that's enough for every Cabindan to receive $100,000 per year and then some. And yet, it remains one of the poorest provinces in Angola. Anyway, sometime in the 1960s, several movements advocating for Cabindan independence were formed. The most prominent being the movement for the liberation of the Enclave of Cabinda under the leadership of Luis Ranque Franque. This group later merged with the Action Committee of the Cabinda National Union and the Mayombe National Alliance, which represented the Mayombe area, to form the Front for the Liberation of the Enclave of Cabinda in 1963. Also around this time, the Organization for African Unity listed Cabinda as the 39th territory on the continent yet to be decolonized, Angola being the 35th. Taking a page from the newly reorganized National Front for the Liberation of Angola, FLEC established a government in exile on January 10, 1967, in a move welcomed by Gabon, the Central African Republic, and Uganda, among others. More importantly though, FLEC began to receive organizational and material support from Zaire and Congo-Brazzaville. In particular, President Fulbert Yulu of Congo-Brazzaville had a personal hand in encouraging the aforementioned merger of the various Cabindan separatist movements back in 1963. While all this was going on, the Angolan War of Independence, itself part of the larger Portuguese Colonial War, known in Portugal as the Overseas War and in the former colonies as the War of Liberation, was in full swing. Having started with a revolt on January 3, 1961, the conflict quickly spread to all corners of the Portuguese Colonial Empire. In Angola, the call for revolution was initially taken up by two groups: the left-wing People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, and the nominally center-right Union of the Peoples of Angola, UPA, which in 1962 became the previously mentioned FNLA. These two were later joined by the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, in 1966. Drawing its base of support mainly from central and southern Angola, UNITA was led by Jonas Savimbi, who you might remember from Call of Duty Black Ops 2.
The mortars have stopped! Here they come! Here they come, my brothers! Fight, my brothers!
The war, although outside the scope of this video, from its very beginning was a brutal affair, with atrocities being committed by all forces involved. For instance, on March 15, 1961, the opening day of the conflict, some 4,000 to 5,000 UPA fighters under the command of Holden Roberto launched an incursion into northern Angola from the newly independent Republic of the Congo with the express purpose of sowing fear among the colony's population. As such, they targeted both European and African civilian non-combatants, including women and children, killing around 7,000 people. When recalling this operation several decades later, Roberto said, "This time, the slaves did not cower, they massacred everything." In the end, however, the Portuguese were able to achieve an overall military victory. Following the so-called Carnation Revolution on April 25, 1974, which overthrew the Estado Novo regime back in Lisbon though, everything changed and Portugal began to look for an exit strategy. Negotiations with various African independence movements eventually saw Portuguese troops withdraw from Portuguese Guinea, which thereafter became Guinea-Bissau. This was followed in 1975 by Cape Verde, Mozambique, São Tomé and Príncipe, and following the signing of the Alvor Agreement on January 15th, Angola. Angola thereafter officially became independent on November 11th, and, as per the Alvor Agreement, a transitional government composed of representatives from the 4 major parties was established. FLEC, which technically had been a participant in the Angolan War of Independence, in reality had limited itself to just Cabindan independence and therefore was not invited. But that didn't really matter, as the transitional government collapsed pretty much immediately, with the MPLA violently forcing the FNLA out of the capital Luanda in July 1975, while UNITA withdrew to its stronghold in the south. That August, FLEC's leadership proclaimed the independence of the Republic of Cabinda, with Zaire's Mobutu Sese Seko openly expressing his support for Cabindan self-determination. Now, before this even happened, back in 1964, MPLA forces had effectively occupied Cabinda. From this point onward, FLEC operated a guerrilla-type war, attacking troops of the self-declared People's Republic of Angola, and later, Cuban forces, which had intervened on behalf of the MPLA, now refashioned as a Marxist-Leninist party, during the as-of-then still ongoing Angolan Civil War. Despite the low-intensity nature of the insurgency, for the first 15 years of Angola's existence, Luanda had at any point approximately 2,000 troops stationed in Cabinda. FLEC, with continued Zairean support, increased its attacks on Angolan and Cuban troops in Cabinda, while also kidnapping foreign employees working in the oil and construction business. In response, government forces allegedly destroyed an entire village in the Bukazao region, which in turn caused a large number of Cabindans to flee as refugees to Zaire. Shortly after this, Zaire closed its border with Cabinda, and in 1979 signed off on a peace accord with Angola, which led the former to cut off support for FLEC. Speaking of which, by this point, FLEC had splintered into multiple different groups, including FLEC-Renovada and FLEC Armed Forces of Cabinda. During the 1992 Angolan general elections, the first ostensibly free and multi-party elections held in the country, FLEC-FAC and other Cabindan separatist groups called for a boycott of the vote, as a law on political parties enacted in May 1991 effectively banned Cabindan groups, as it prohibited the formation of parties that are local and regional in character or affect national unity and territorial integrity. As a result, only between 7 to 12% of Cabindans voted in the 1992 election. A different strategy was employed by some, including Frente, who suggested that open dialogue with Luanda was more likely to achieve something of worth for Cabinda. This eventually resulted in the Angolan government considering so-called large autonomy for Cabinda, akin to Portugal's model of governance with the Azores or Madeira. However, when full-scale civil war again broke out after several opposition parties, including UNITA, rejected the 1992 election results, the government deployed some 15,000 troops in Cabinda, while FLEC-FAC launched a campaign to control much of the rural interior, which it effectively did with a force of just 600 to 1,000 men. Throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the insurgency in Cabinda intensified, and in response, Luanda waged a brutal counterinsurgency, having now deployed some 30,000 troops, including an unknown number of special forces, which targeted villages suspected of supporting the separatists. The situation quickly deteriorated, with Angolan troops being accused of various human rights abuses, as detailed in a 20-page report by the Ad Hoc Commission for Human Rights in Cabinda, which allegedly include extrajudicial killings, disappearances, arbitrary detention, torture, rape, forced marriages, and looting. Then, in July 2006, somewhat unexpectedly, a large number of Cabindan separatist groups, including FLEC-R, working under a recently formed umbrella organization, the Cabinda Forum for Dialogue, headed by Antonio Bento Bembe, signed a ceasefire with the Angolan government. In exchange for condemning the insurgency and separatism, CFD secured a general amnesty, along with special economic status and governmental powers for Cabinda. Bembe would also be appointed minister without portfolio by the Angolan government, and it wasn't long before a number of separatists emerged from the heavily forested areas of Cabinda to lay down their arms and reintegrate back into society. However, not everyone was on board with this, and FLEC-FAC denounced the ceasefire. Then, on January 8, 2010, perhaps the most well-known incident, or at least that with the most international coverage, in the Cabinda War occurred, when members of a little-known splinter group, Front for the Liberation of the Enclave of Cabinda military position, FLEC-PM, attacked a bus carrying the Togo national football team on its way to a stadium in Cabinda for the Africa Cup of Nations. The attack lasted around 30 minutes and began when 15 FLEC-PM fighters ambushed the bus minutes after it crossed the border from Congo-Brazzaville, ultimately killing 3 people and injuring 9 in a hail of gunfire. The 2010 Togo national football team bus attack, however, is, as of the writing of this script, the last major incident to have occurred in the still technically ongoing Cabinda War. In 2012, FLEC-FAC announced its readiness to declare a ceasefire and pursue a negotiated resolution to the conflict. That being said, some have still not given up the goal of an independent Cabinda. And for its part, Luanda unquestionably still considers these separatists a real threat, as it seemingly carried out a number of targeted assassinations across the border in Congo-Brazzaville back in March 2011. So, the Cabinda War, while perhaps now quieter than most, still wages on.